Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I'm going to do a VR to Kelly at the Truth and Story with my Irreplaceable decks. So a little while ago, Kelly did a video where she talked about the Irreplaceable decks in her collection, as in decks that she doesn't have anything else in her collection that fills that same space. So she wasn't necessarily talking about like her most sentimental decks, you know, like the first deck or those really hard to find out of print decks, but more talking about those decks that kind of do their own thing and couldn't be easily replaced or substituted with another deck. So I've got quite a few decks here that I'm going to go through. We're going to start with some of the same ones that Kelly mentioned because I totally agree with her and I think that these are all irreplaceable decks. So I'm just going to real quickly go through these and then I'm going to talk about some of the other decks that I have picked that are decks that I consider my irreplaceable decks. So the first deck we'll talk about is the Mary L. Again, these are all decks that Kelly mentioned in her video. The Mary L, I think I agree with Kelly, does something really different, and I can't think of another deck that really taps into the same kind of energy and occupies the same space as the Mary L. This is my fully intact first edition. I do have another first edition deck that I've completely modified and trimmed and rebacked and all that good stuff, complete with the gilding and everything. Again, this is a deck that just really does something different. It's a really interesting blend of kind of RWS and Marseille, a little bit of Thoth, a little bit of kind of doing its own thing. And you can definitely tell that this deck was a labor of love. It's definitely not something that was, you know, just kind of produced in a couple of months. And it's definitely something that has a lot of deep symbolism, a lot of energy, and a lot of esoterica within it, as well as I feel a lot of emotion. I love this High Priestess cards. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to keep the first edition and not work with the second, because they changed that, as well as the Hierophant card. And I did a lot of work with the Hierophant card, so I definitely wanted to keep it in the deck because it's one that I had to personally do a lot of work with to come around to an understanding of it. So the Mary L definitely does its own thing and is definitely not a deck that I could easily substitute out something else for. So the same with the Wildwood. Again, this is another deck that Kelly mentioned. It definitely does its own thing. I am currently doing a year in the Wildwood, which I'm working with this deck throughout the whole turn of the year, along with the additional book that was created from the Facebook group studying this deck. But again, this is a deck that very much takes a seasonal approach to the tarot. It's very pagan, and it definitely does its own thing in a lot of ways. I wouldn't necessarily say that it falls into one particular system or another. Again, it's kind of an interesting blend that really dives into the seasonal representation and the myths and the stories that go along with that and the turn of the wheel. And so again, this isn't a deck that I feel like I would have anything else in my collection that would occupy that space. So this one again is the Wildwood Tarot. A deck that Kelly mentioned was the Hush Tarot. Again, this is a deck that I feel like doesn't have an equal in my space, in my practice, and I don't know that I could even like look to another deck either in the marketplace or that one that I own that would have the same kind of feel and energy that this deck has. It definitely taps into the energy of the cycle of life, of birth and death and decay, and I think it just does it really, really beautifully. There's some really interesting things going on in the cards. And again, it's a deck that I feel like really has a very unique energy and a very unique place in my practice. I cannot think of another deck that would replace it. A few decks that Kelly mentioned is the Fairies Oracle. So this is a deck that actually has come into my collection, left my collection, and come back again. And I feel like the first time I wasn't really ready for it. I feel like I'm more ready for it this time, but harnesses the energy of the Fae in a way that no other deck does. Now I do have another Fae deck, and you could kind of consider the Hush Tarot a little bit of a Fae deck too, but again, totally different energy, and there isn't another fairy deck out there that I could even remotely say that is like this deck besides its companion deck over here. This Heart of the Fairies is sadly out of print. I was able to get a secondhand copy of it, and this was the deck. There was something about this particular deck that just was my connection point, because of course it was the out of print one, right? It wasn't the one that was readily available on Amazon. So of course that's the one I would be drawn to. But really beginning my work with this deck is really what has opened up my work and my use of Brian Froud's fairy decks. And again, besides the Fairy Oracle, which again, there's just not another deck out there like this. And I feel that this really does have a different energy than the Fairies Oracle. They don't quite occupy the same space for me. So I have them out here individually because they are, even though they're by the same artist, they're the same kind of deck, they definitely do have a very unique energy of their own, and it's not something that I could ever replace with anything else. So those are kind of the quick few that Kelly mentioned as well. I'll definitely be leaving a link to her video in the description box below for you. So let's take a look at a few others that I've pulled out of my tarot library. So moving into a couple of decks that I feel like are irreplaceable in their energy and what they have to offer. We have the Tarot of the She. This is my newer, more recently modified trimmed version. And this deck, I think, even though like we just looked at the Brian Froud fairies, this deck has a very unique she energy that is almost otherworldly. So whereas the Brian Froud fairies feels like they are kind of like more in line with earth energy, this to me feels more in line with cosmic energy. So I feel like these are almost like a little bit alien in their representation. And it has a really unique, powerful, very high energy vibration in this deck, and it's definitely something that stands alone in my collection. I don't have anything else that really occupies this same space. I definitely don't have anything else that feels like it is kind of in this alien-like world. To me, again, where the Brian Froud fairies are more of the earth or maybe earth adjacent, these feel like these are beings that have come down from the cosmos. They may be she, they may be fairies, they may be aliens, just kind of a little bit of all of that rolled into one. I definitely get more of that cosmic otherworldly energy in this deck. And whereas I have other decks that have that kind of cosmic feel to them, this one feels very alien in its energy and in its depiction, like in a really good way. I love this deck, but I definitely don't feel like I have anything else in my collection that really hits that same spot. So another deck that I feel like really occupies its own unique space in my collection is the Secret Garden Oracle. And this is, the Tree Whisper Oracle, The Secret Garden by Mags Black. And I do feel like this deck really does occupy a unique space, and I realize I think it might be the only Oracle deck that I have in this whole collection, which is unusual because I really thought that I would pull more Oracle than Tarot, but apparently for me, all of my Oracle decks feel replaceable. They all feel like they, in a sense, kind of have a really similar energy, and I could interchange a lot of my Oracle decks, which is really interesting when you stop to look at that. There are very few Oracles to me that I feel like I couldn't find something else that was similar to that. But this particular Oracle has a very unique feel to it. We have photographs that are creating these kind of tree spirits. And it does, even though I have other decks that have trees, I have other decks that tap into a similar kind of energy in a sense, this feels more unique and it feels more kind of in that Brian Froud energy where it feels very earthy, very magical, very almost fae-like in its depictions, but it's real trees. And that, I think, really is what lends itself to the unique energy of this deck. It's absolutely beautiful, and I really enjoy working with it. The keywords are fantastic. It is fairly new to my collection, so I'm just kind of still finding my way with it. But it's definitely something that I feel like I don't have anything that really hits this same spot for me. It's unique in that sense, and I really love working with these tree spirits. To be perfectly honest, I enjoy working with this deck alongside the Brian Froud Fairies deck. There's something about the energetic exchange of these decks that just work really beautifully. And again, I have other tree oracle decks, but they don't feel the same as this one. They don't feel like they occupy the same space. Those feel more like everyday trees, where these, even though they are everyday trees, right? These are real trees that exist in the world, or did at one point, because these are photographs. It feels more otherworldly. It feels more fae. It feels more magical. And it's just like, and I love the faces. I love the faces that these trees make and these little spirits that come out of it. It's just an absolutely beautiful and unique oracle deck in my collection. I definitely don't feel like I've had any other decks that really hit this same spot or really work in the same way. I have had other tree spirit oracle decks. There's a couple of them out there, but they just don't have the same, I don't know how else to put it other than realistic energy. Like this deck kind of feels like a conduit to the tree spirits, where the other decks just feel like I'm looking at tree spirits but not necessarily interacting with them, and this deck feels more like a conduit or a portal into that space. And again, I don't have any other decks that do that. I'm not sure I have any other decks that really do that in general, in a general sense, but certainly not with the tree energy. So this deck is definitely an irreplaceable one for me. So another tarot deck that I do feel is quite irreplaceable is the Affidia Rosa Tarot, because while I have the other decks by this creator that do feel like they occupy the same space, I don't have any other decks that for me personally hit where this deck hits. I talked about this deck in my curiosity tag as well. It just has a really unique energy to it, and it may be a very me thing because of the type of work that I've done with it, because of the way that I've come around to a connection with it, and the way that I've learned to work with this deck. But I don't feel like I really have anything else that hits this mark. It's not really an RWS. It's not really a Marseille. It's not really a Thoth. It's kind of its own thing. And the way that a lot of the cards are depicted and the energy that I get from them, particularly when working with the little booklet that comes with it, and my own language that I've developed with this deck, my own understanding and my own interpretation of these cards, is very much its own thing. And so for me, it's definitely a deck that is irreplaceable because I don't have anything like this that I have developed this sort of connection and language with in this way. So for me, this deck definitely has its very own language and energy. And it's something that occupies a very unique space for me. And again, that could be a very me thing, but again, we're talking about my irreplaceable decks. So it's definitely a deck that I feel like kind of does its own thing, has its own kind of energy. We're gonna throw one more in here, and it's actually in this box, which is where I keep it. So this is, of course, my little trimmed Llewellyn. We've seen this deck. We've all seen this deck, right? And this is a deck that, like, it is still readily available. You can still buy the Llewellyn Tarot. It's not like it's a hard to find deck or anything like that. But for me, this deck is all about the personal connection that I have to this particular version, because I do have multiple copies of this deck. I do have another copy of this deck that is in the same cardstock and is the same edition and all of that. And it's kind of my backup for this one in case something were to ever happen to it. But it still doesn't feel the same as this deck, and it doesn't read the same as this deck. So this deck is one that is very unique to me because of, again, my personal connection to it. This particular deck, right? Not just the Llewellyn Tarot, but this one right here. This particular copy of the Llewellyn Tarot is irreplaceable to me because it is the only deck that feels like this to me, which is funny because it has the cardboardy cardstock that I hate, but there is something about the way that this particular deck feels in my hand. It's just a very unique experience. The way that this particular copy of this deck reads for me. I have read with other versions of the Llewellyn Tarot because I have multiple versions of this deck. They don't read the same for me. They don't feel the same. So it is definitely something that's very unique to this particular copy and this particular deck. Okay, so now let's talk about a couple of out of print decks. So I've just kind of put these three together because they are all irreplaceable in a sense that they're very hard to get a hold of because they are all out of print. So I've put them together for that reason. However, that to me is not why they are irreplaceable. They are irreplaceable because each of these decks does something very unique and very different. This is the Celtic Wisdom Tarot, again, an out of print deck. And it is still in order because I am still learning and getting to know this deck and working on my studies with it. But this deck does something very different. It has a different sort of structure. A lot of the cards have been renamed and reimagined. The suits are all different. It really is its own unique take on the tarot. Again, my apologies for showing out of print decks, but you know, these are my irreplaceable decks. And this one I was very, very fortunate to be able to get a copy of. And I really love the take on this deck. I really love what the creator has done, what the artist has done. I love the illustrations and the different kind of approach to the tarot. So the next one is the Animals Divine Tarot. And this to me is super unique because we have the animals in the minor arcana and the deities or gods and goddesses in the major arcana and the courts, as you can see here. And I'm just not aware of any other deck that does that in this way. And I absolutely love it. It is, for me, this deck is the perfect blend of as above, so below, kind of tying in that cosmic and the earthy. We get the deities through that universal connection, and then the animals to represent the kind of really earthy everyday life. I absolutely love it. I have no other decks that not only do that same thing, to my knowledge. I could be wrong. There might be other decks out there that do that. But again, none of them do it in quite the same way that this one does. This one is very much, again, a very me thing, as in I'm very attached to it, and the way that I work with it is very specific. And I don't have another deck in my collection that occupies this same space or that even remotely does the same thing that this one does in terms of its structure and the type of work that I use it for. Then we have the Tilde Wig Tarot. This is the first edition. Again, another, you know, out of print deck, very hard to get a hold of. There was a second printing, but I think even that one's hard to get a hold of now. This deck is super unique and really occupies its own special place in my collection because it feels like a deck of meditation through space, through place is really what I guess I mean. These decks or these cards work really well for path working for me. And while I have other decks that I use for path working, this deck has a very unique energy to it. I have other decks that have kind of this sort of Victorian or Renaissance type feel, but none of them occupy the same space as this one does, as this to me feels like stepping into this place, putting myself in this world. And while I have other decks that I can do that with, none of them occupy the same physical place that this one does. And so I feel it's very unique in that sense. It definitely has a really unique energy to it as well. It's definitely a deck that I use for quiet contemplation. It's a deck that makes me slow down. It's a deck that makes me take my time and really sink into the work that I'm doing. And again, where I have other decks that do that or do something similar, none of them are in this same place, if that makes sense. Hopefully that's making some sense, but none of them occupy the same place. And I guess for me, that's what this deck is. It's very much a deck of a very specific place and a very specific energy. All right, so wrapping up, we're going to talk about a couple of decks that are irreplaceable because I've done heavy modifications to them. So while you can buy another copy of all of these decks, they are still readily available. These ones all have a very unique feel to me because they are all decks that I have put my own blood, sweat, and tears into. So the first one is my modified Nicoletta Chicoli Tarot. And this deck, as you can see, has been trimmed. It has been rebacked, and I have edged it, and I edged it and made it look all funky and distressed and well-worn, which is wonderful. That's a different tag, but the other thing about this deck is that I went through the whole process of basically reordering the entire deck and creating a whole new guidebook for this deck. And I even made a new card because there was one card in particular that I did not care for and did not fit into the structure that I created to work with this deck. And so I printed off a new card to replace that one. Still using Nicoletta Chicoli's imagery. That's the card that I printed my own copy of. It does kind of stick a little bit more, and it's a little bit thicker. Sorry, it's a little bit thicker than the other one, so it tends to kind of stick a little bit more. But I do have a whole video on what I did with this deck. But even though you can still buy the Nicoletta Chicoli, and I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful deck. I don't really recommend it for beginners, but it's a really wonderful deck. And I do a lot of what I call wounded child work with it, kind of working to heal my inner child. It's fantastic for that. But this particular version, because I have done such a heavy modification of it and completely restructured the deck and written my own little guidebook for it, to me, this is a one of a kind. There's not another one out there that's exactly like that, because it's kind of my own version of the Nicoletta Chicoli. So another deck that has been really heavily modified and again feels like its own thing, still also readily available. This is the Crystal Visions Tarot. I have trimmed it and edged it and all that good stuff. But the other thing that I did with this deck, and I'll see if I can get it, maybe if I pull this light down, I'm gonna see if I can get it to pick up. I don't know if it will, but I have added pearlescent paint to every single card in this deck. I don't know if it will show up on camera, but I've basically used pearlescent paints to accent this entire deck, and then I sprayed it with lamination to seal it in, or clear coat, acrylic to seal it in. But anyway, sometimes you can see where my hand got a little heavy with the spraying, but this deck for me is definitely a one of a kind because I've painted it, right? Like I've detailed out every single image. And similar to what I did with the Druid Craft, I mentioned, I think I have a video on that one where I actually showed my repainting process with the Druid Craft. That one is still not done, so I'm not gonna show it, but I'll leave a link to that video in the description box below if you want to check it out. But I'm not changing anything about the card. I just used pearlescent paint in matching colors to create a shimmery accent to every single card in the deck. And so this is a very unique version. Oh, can you see that one? I love that card, but it got like a real heavy coat of the acrylic clear coat over the top. I love this dragon. This was definitely a labor of love, but it was so much fun and I really enjoyed the process. You know, so much so that I redid it with my Druid Craft and I'm still working on that project. It is very time consuming. It is definitely a labor of love. And even though this deck is, again, still readily available, you can buy a copy of the Crystal Tarot and you could do this exact same thing yourself if you wanted to. This one feels very unique to me because, again, I painted on it. So it's got my own unique touches and where I thought the cards needed accent, you know, where I decided to put that pearlescent paint on. So, again, it's a very kind of my own thing kind of a deck. So again, irreplaceable because you won't find another one out there that's been repainted like that. Probably because nobody else is as crazy as I am and will spend that much time adding embellishments to a deck. Okay, speaking of embellishments and modifications, this is my Antique Anatomy Tarot, and this is what I call my altered Antique Anatomy Tarot. So again, I do have an entire video on this deck and this process as well. I do have multiple copies of the Antique Anatomy Tarot. I have the Indie edition, I have, of course, this edition, and then I have the re-release of the mass market edition in the little bit thicker cardstock. But this one, of course, is very unique to me because of the modification that I did on it. I completely altered this deck with the creator's permission. I always like to note that because I did reach out to Claire first and let her know that this was my idea and she was all on board. So with the creator's permission. However, you don't need a creator's permission, I just gotta say, to modify your decks, right? But because I wanted to make a video on it, I wanted to, you know, reach out. Because this is a pretty big modification, and it was so much fun. It was so much work, but it was so much fun. And to me, this deck has its own feel. It feels totally different than the other versions of the Antique Anatomy that I own. It reads totally different than the other Antique Anatomy versions that I own. And yes, I do read with this particular deck, even as wonky and like all, like, look at this thing. You know, because this is now a handmade tarot deck. And I love it. I love working with it. Again, I'll link the video on the whole creation process of this deck for you, but it's definitely one of the most unique and irreplaceable decks I think I have in my collection, because even if I tried to reproduce this whole project again, it would never come out this same way. So this is definitely a unique experience. This, I think, is my favorite card. I love the way this High Priestess card came out. It was just, yeah. Again, this was totally a labor of love, and this Judgment card's really cool too. It's just, yeah, irreplaceable, because I could never in a million years reproduce this in the exact same way. So definitely irreplaceable and very unique in my collection. So there we have it. Those are my irreplaceable decks in my collection. Some of the ones that, of course, Kelly mentioned. Decks that really do their own thing or have a very unique energy for me. And then, of course, some of the decks that I have modified that definitely have a very me kind of energy to them now. I want to thank Kelly for putting this wonderful tag together for all of us to share. I will definitely leave her video linked in the description box below for you. As always, you will find links for everything that I have shown here, along with a couple of the videos that I've mentioned that relate to some of these modification processes in the description box below for you. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to sharing with you again soon.